specific for each sector. Because as you can understand, we know that not every environmental or social risk that affects an oil and gas company in the energy sector will affect a bank in the financial sector. The ESG risks and opportunities are different there. Each sector and each company deserves to be analyzed in context to whatever ESG risks and opportunities it's faced with, rather than giving them a blanket ESG score across the board. When we find companies that have ESG risks that we can specifically address, what we do is we specifically engage with those companies, help them understand the risks and opportunities that they face, and work together to solve for a problem, and to have that company ultimately become a leader in its respective sector. We invest in companies that are positioned to be sector and industry leaders through their positive environmental, social, and governance policies and practices. And even some of the examples that John had given earlier about industry leaders, those are the companies and trends that we are excited about, not only because of their innovation, but because of their positive ESG practices. And though we don't market any of our funds necessarily as being ESG funds, all of them, every single fund that we have and every company we invest in passes through this ESG investment process. Now I want to walk through one very specific example on a capital group's ESG policy on engagement to bring more color to what our process looks like and how we engage with companies. So Barrick Gold is a mining company that specifically operates in Africa, and from the course of 2010 to 2016 had a number of ESG related controversies when it came to the working conditions of the mines and human rights concerns. Ultimately, we chose not to invest with Barrick Gold during that period because of that series of offenses and a failure to change their behavior and culture during those times. During a management change in 2018, our analysts that covered this company spent 10 days in Africa meeting the new management, the new employees, local community members, and other stakeholders to evaluate whether the changes that the company stated that they would make and ultimately made would be meaningful enough for us to choose to invest and engage with them. Ultimately, our analysts saw that for the company to improve worker relations and conditions at the mines, the new company and management team hired more employees from the local towns rather than bringing in workers from other communities to help strengthen the relationship between the company and the workers and to create more trust between the two groups. Beyond this change, there were other elements of engagement that our analyst conducted, and through those engagements, he decided that the company's improvements were meaningful enough to ultimately improve employee safety and not be at such a severe ESG risk. We now invest in Barrick Gold because of the management's commitment to decreasing exposure to those ESG risks that they face. The company is still flagged by our monitoring process due to its past ESG-related issues, so we regularly engage with the company to ensure progress on its culture and working conditions. So you see there that not only do we engage with companies, understand that they may have ESG-related risks, but we understand that these are great long-term opportunities or may be great long-term opportunities for our investors, engage with the companies to assess and identify any risk they have, and ultimately improve them to deliver long-term value to our shareholders. During our time together, we have covered that ESG investing is an investment process that understands and incorporates a company and sector's environmental, social, and governance-related risks and opportunities. We discussed how Capital Group integrates ESG factors into our company analysis at a very fundamental level through individual sector frameworks. And we saw how engaging with companies that improve on ESG issues can create fruitful relationships and ultimately long-term investment opportunities for our investors. Thank you all for a little bit of time for me to cover a few ESG issues on this front. I will let Guru go ahead and facilitate some of the question and answer.
Sure. Maddy, thank you for that insightful presentation. And, this perspective on ESG is so relevant. And in fact, I must share with you and John that we had a full-blown conference. It was a two-day conference on sustainability and environment a couple of months back, which Policy Times hosted. And we would have loved to have you in that event as well. But thank you for sharing this. Policy Times, is pioneering the climate change theme at the policy level, and financial services and investments related to climate change is one of the themes that Policy Times is equally excited about. I must also tell the audience that we bring this show in partnership with Indus International Research Foundation, and I'm one of the founder members of the foundation. I know the founder president, Colonel Vijay Chenji is watching the show. Colonel Vijay, thank you and welcome to the show. We also partnered with the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, Dallas chapter, and I'm on the board of the chapter as well. So given the dynamic environment that we are in, and the changes that are happening, while we are talking about a portfolio strategy that will be effective, which will produce results, like John said, he'd like to use the term results, desired results, whatever it may be. John, let me come back to you. So how does Capital Group go about identifying a company to invest? What is the process, and what is the secret behind your success?
I don't know if there's any secret. I think, as I said, with very experienced folks in a collaborative structure, and given the resources to go conduct all of that research, that's been what's been able to really identify good companies. Let me give you an example. I think it's a good one of how bringing in people with maybe various different backgrounds has benefited our investors. So there was an analyst that we hired to be in the healthcare industry. So his focus was to identify companies in healthcare. And his name is Dr. Craig Gordon. He maintains his his medical degree and licensing. And so because of that, while he is conducting his research on companies, he maintains his ability to see the information from ongoing drug trials. So a few years ago, this analyst was reviewing some chatter online between folks who were taking an experimental drug from Kite Pharmaceuticals for cancer treatments. And he was so enthusiastic about the positive results that he was hearing and seeing that he went and made an investment within two of our funds within Kite Pharmaceuticals. And that company was recognized as a leader. It was rewarded by actually being purchased by Gilead Pharmaceuticals. And for our investors, that was a very positive outcome. And again, it has allowed him to take his experience and his medical degree and apply that to something that is both beneficial for the company that is trying to bring real solutions out there to a real world problem, which is cancer, as well as to benefit those investors here at American Fund. So that's one example about this. I will also just say that, I want to reiterate something that Maddy said, and that is where ESG and whatever term has been discussed in the past, many people think of that as something that screens out firms or industries that do not align to what people think is a positive development in ESG. So Capital Group really thinks very differently about that. The example that she provided, I think, shows that we believe that engagement is much better than exclusion. So rather than having an ESG investment fund that does not allow for investments in certain area, we choose to engage in all of various industries to identify companies that are making positive steps. Because if Capital Group may not be an owner, those shares could fall into the hands of those that are less inclined to steer them towards a more positive outlook in the future. So I think Maddy made a great point with her illustration. I just wanted to put that into different words.
Sure. Thank you, John. Maddy, would you like to add and supplement to what John said?
Yeah, So John did a great point on ultimately understanding and identifying the two ideas around ESG. You engage or you exclude. There's a lot more to that, but for the relevance to our call, those are two differentiating behaviors between money managers, whether I'm going to have a mutual fund that completely excludes oil, tobacco, alcohol, arms, ultimately because those have different environmental, social, and governance risks. It's inherent to the sector and inherent to that company. But where Capital Group stands out is we understand that according to the sector, according to the company, there are going to be inherent risks, but ultimately, why we engage with one of the largest tobacco companies and choose to invest in them is because they generate 25% of their revenue from smokeless tobacco products. And they've decided from a management and company level that they would ultimately like to move all of their products to smokeless, tobacco free. So these are all companies that we choose to invest in and engage with because they're established well now. We have no reason to, because there's an identifiable risk that can be addressed, there's no reason we shouldn't engage with these companies and ultimately be a predominant shareholder to help them ultimately get to the more compliant ESG future that they set for themselves.
Sure. Maddy, thank you for that perspective. Let me go back to John. I've had conversations with hundreds of investors in my career, and I'm sure you've done the same in some way or the other. One question that stands out is $1 million question, literally. What makes an investor successful, right? There are people who relate their investment experience and tell me, you know what, Guru, I've been investing stocks, but I never made money, or I lost money, or I never make those millions of dollars that some people seem to make. So where is this puzzle getting sorted, John? What makes an investor successful?
Sure. Yeah, that is the $1 million question. I was once told that an investment portfolio is a lot like a bar of soap. The more you touch it, the smaller it gets. And I think that for investors, knowing history can be a very strong correlation to success. So, we know history of our country, we know history of the world, but people should know market history. And so, as an example, if you look back 70 years, there have been roughly 10 bear markets, and I'm speaking from the U.S. perspective. A bear market is defined by having 20% decline or more before any recovery begins. So 10 significant downturns, and they tend to last about a year and 2 months, right? So a very painful period, and the average is a loss of about 33%. That's what everybody remembers. What they may not remember, though, is what comes after those bear markets historically are very long and strong bull markets. So from a 33% average decline, the average return is about 280%. And it lasts for, I think, 6 years, 72 months or so. So history has shown us that bear markets, they are periodic and they happen. But for those investors who have the long-term time frame and can stay invested through the pain, bull markets are stronger and longer, which leads me to the observation that don't try to time the market. If you use emotion to make investment decisions and you remove your assets and go to a safer asset class, maybe cash, treasuries, gold, then you have to get the timing right again, which is when do I come back? And it rarely feels good when it is a good time to invest, which is when asset prices are low. So successful investors tend to, again, work with an advisor, work with some sort of structure, and then they stick with the plan and don't let short-term volatility scare them out of it. That's really ultimately what has brought success.
John, that's a great message. Don't time the market, but timing the market is important. Absolutely. Great. Maddy, I want to switch back to you. Can you tell us how Capital Group is engaged with companies other than being money managers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that for the most part, it relates back to our previous conversation around, integrating companies with our investment philosophy and excluding them. One way that I think to expand on that conversation is we understand, two different philosophies around ESG, but why is it important? When we consider putting together our own portfolios and choosing specific funds, working with specific managers. Ultimately, as John brought up earlier, the world is innovating. It's becoming more digitized and it's full of even more opportunity than ever before. And through innovation, there always comes, with opportunity, there always comes risk. And usually we think of risk to investments as being normal business risk. Is this company going to survive the next downturn? Is this an opportunity for me to have a strong long-term investment? But with ESG analysis and getting to your point of why Capital Group's integration philosophy is so powerful, is we see that with ESG analysis, there are very specific risks, whether it's climate risk, employee working conditions, and any lawsuits that may be created from poor conditions, impartiality of corporate boards, and that ultimately creating some internal issues within companies. There are various risks within companies that can ultimately affect long-term value to our investors and even to some of your clients, Guru, as well. And risk is very costly. It takes money to settle lawsuits or to have company assets that, because of climate change or regulatory standards by governments and other regulatory agencies, company assets may be abandoned. So when we think of a long-term future for an investment, there are risks beyond the normal. Is this company strong enough to last during a downturn? But is this company able to survive regulatory risk, environmental risk, and any other types of ESG social risk as well that may have an impact on the long-term value of your portfolio as an investor?
So you have a specific focus group that's evaluating the risk of these companies all the time as part of your process.
Well, the great part about Capital Group and our ESG analysis is at some of our competitors, we have, analysts, portfolio analysts, and then ESG analysts. And at Capital Group, everybody is an ESG analyst. Our portfolio managers and our other analysts who work on all of our mutual funds, they all integrate ESG data, their own findings and research, all within a cloud where they share information called Ethos. And so we're working together as an entire organization to share all of the information that we find on ESG issues to help our portfolio managers and analysts make the best long-term investment decisions for our clients.
Thank you, Maddy. Another important part of the conversation, getting back to John, in any investment process and portfolio strategies, to look at, should we invest in growth or should we invest in income? And income represented by dividends, especially in capital markets. So John, looking at 2030, obviously we're taking a long-term view, but we also have another short-term opportunity that investors are constantly looking at dividend-paying stocks. So can you tell us what role dividends play in the investment portfolio strategy?
Sure. Thank you. So dividends, simply put, are one of the clearest ways for a profitable company doing good business, doing good work, to deliver that back to their owners. Right? It is a true hard dollar return, whereas appreciation of a stock, as we know, can ebb and flow, and it's not a certainty. When you get 5, 10, 15 cents given back to you per share, that is a real return of value. And I mentioned we started in 1931. So our oldest investment we can look back to is from 1934. It started paying dividends in 1936 and has paid one ever since then. And so this is a fund that seeks to own companies that can appreciate, but also return some of that in dividends. And if you look at the total value of an investment from its inception to now, 90% of the total value of that portfolio today comes from reinvested dividends. So as we look globally, American Funds Capital Group, we work with managers, management, I should say, of companies, and really show them the benefit to demonstrating their commitment to starting, maintaining, or even growing their dividends in attracting the right type of shareholders. So we believe very strongly that can be a very significant contributor long-term to portfolio value. In the short term, companies that have been putting their profits back in and growing at a faster pace, you refer to them as growth-oriented companies versus value, they have done very well. So to me, it means that we need to strike a balance in our portfolios and own both of them. But the good fortune of Capital Group is that we get to work with managers and really encourage them to consider what role dividends play in their business strategy as well.
Sure. John, thank you for that. I know we have another 4 minutes between you and Maddy. I just have one last question for Maddy. Can you educate our audience on greenwashing? I'm not sure how many have heard about that term, but we'd like to hear from you on greenwashing and what role that is playing in the investments.
Definitely. So greenwashing is an incredibly important term to understand if you are new to the ESG space, still getting your feet wet. Ultimately, like ESG, we're still working on an industry definition. We're still working on a consensus on what that means. That leaves space for greenwashing, which is with this rush of consumers, investors wanting ESG-oriented funds that either exclude or integrate ESG analysis within their investment profile. Ultimately, there are funds that are almost rushed to production. The investment philosophy isn't sound on ESG. Ultimately, there have been stories in the news of funds that may be marketed as ESG, but hold companies that are not ESG compliant. Ultimately, it's one way to put a label of ESG on a mutual fund, an ETF, or another product to claim it being ESG when it actually is not ESG compliant according to its prospectus. So it's one of the concerns that we have at Capital Group, making sure that we ourselves are not overstating when it comes to ESG, but thoroughly integrating ESG in our investment philosophy. And another example that I can actually bring up around greenwashing is around the company Boohoo, which is British-based and is an online clothing retailer. And we had engaged with them over the past few years, getting to understand their company on a deeper level. And they were a company actually integrated in about 20 ESG labeled funds, and most predominantly in the Employee Opportunities Fund over in the UK. And through our company analysis, and this was a scandal that came out about a year ago, Boohoo ended up having scandals related to ESG by underpaying their employees, as well as not having proper working conditions. And of course, underpaying employees in the US and in the UK is illegal. So when we think about investing in an ESG portfolio, being aware of greenwashing, understanding what your managers in a fund and an ETF are doing to comply with their own standards, as well as the fund's expectations, making sure that's all clear and ultimately making sure that this fund is still aligned with your values and long-term objectives.
Sure. Thank you, Maddy. I'm sure audience are quite enlightened, and many of the people will be looking at a ESG perspective and also a 2030 perspective in their investment strategies, hopefully. But definitely a lot of great information, fantastic insight, and we thank you, John and Maddy, for being here. Thanks from Edward Jones, and thanks on behalf of myself as well. I'll turn it over to Akram to thank you both before we let you go, and then I will stay on here for some questions from audience. If I'm not able to answer any of those, I will, Akram, share my contact with everyone and I can get back to them.
Thank you.
Akram, over to you.
Guru. And wonderful to have John and Maddy sharing a lot of perspectives on investments. I myself is an alien to the concept of investment, but I have started recently watching a lot of big investors or successful investors, investment guides. And it shows just not by earning money, you become a good saver or earner further. It's about how you reinvest the money in terms of creating that, kind of portfolio that you are discussing. So a person getting high salary does not guarantee that he will have good money at the end of his last period of life. It is about how do you manage that money and reinvest it. So, and when we talk about investment, often the mistake we make is that we don't protect the risk and we always tend for higher return in short term. But big investors or the successful investors always plan bigger term portfolios. They invest for 15 years, 20 years. Then only that kind of gain they get. So thank you so much, Maddy and John. A lot of questions I have, in fact, to ask you. Unfortunately, not today. Maybe in future, we'll be very happy to have you back. And then I'll ask a lot of questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.